Greetings viewers, Eric the Car Guy here. Today I've got a special video for you. Many of you have been asking me recently, what's going on with the Fairmont, Eric? I want to see Fairmont videos. Start working on the Fairmont! You have been heard. And today's video is part one of the Fairmont build series. And I would say that this video may be one of the more important videos in this whole series because it involves the plan. Anytime you're going to modify a vehicle, it's a good idea to sit down and figure out exactly what it is you want that vehicle to do when you're done. Then you come up with a plan to try to figure out how to get there. What I'm hoping to do in this video is go over my logic, reasoning, physics behind the things that I'm going to try to do with the Fairmont. So let's get this thing back to the shop, start rolling some cameras, and talk about the plan for the build for the 1979 Ford Fairmont. Well, I was going to go through a lengthy explanation of all of this stuff, but you don't want to hear that. You just want me to get right to the point. So let's do that. And I know where you want to start, with the engine. This is the 3.3 liter straight six that this car was born with. It does just fine for what it does, which is pretty much get this thing down the road. And it's reliable. I haven't had any issues with it. You know, remember the little bit with the radiator hose? Well, so what? My plans involve a little more power. And for that, this is what I've elected to do. But before I tell you what I had finally decided on doing, I'm going to tell you a little story. So ever since I got the Fairmont, I had always had plans to build it into a sleeper. And one of the things that's going to make it a sleeper is the kind of power it has. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the type of power plant that I was going to put into it. I've considered many different things, and I've also taken some suggestions from some of you out there. In fact, some of you that are Fairmont experts have reached out to me with some of your own builds and told me about some of the things that you've done. And I've run into one at SEMA that I thought was pretty cool as well. But there's a lot of things out there that have been done, and I thought, well, why not try to do something that hasn't been done? So my initial thought, and I'd kicked around this for a while, was to put a V6 EcoBoost engine into this. I heavily researched this because I thought, you know, this would be a really cool build to do in a video is to put an EcoBoost engine in this car as a sleeper. When you look at the numbers on paper, that EcoBoost engine puts out as much horsepower as a comparable small block V8 that Ford makes. That would have been kind of a dream kind of thing. However, there were a lot of hurdles to overcome, and the main hurdle is I could not find anybody at the time. I could not find anybody at the time who could actually get me an ECU that could run it. Modern vehicles, I've said this many times in the past, pretty much there's next to no room for modifications. They've engineered out the ability to modify. They've pretty much given it as much fuel economy and as much power as it's going to have out of the box, for the most part. My greatest hurdle, and the reason why I'm not going with the EcoBoost build, well actually there's two reasons why I'm not going with the EcoBoost build, but the main one being is I couldn't get a brain to run it. And that setup, not only does it take all the information from the engine management systems, such as your coolant temperature and your crank and cam position and all the normal sensors that tell the ECU where the engine is and what the engine needs. In addition to that, that computer also takes inputs from the ABS. It has electric power steering. It takes input from electric power steering. It takes input from the dashboard and all your instrument cluster. So it's getting information from all those places. So with this build, just having an engine in place, it's going to be very confused looking for those other components. So I needed somebody to write me a program to run the engine inside this car. Couldn't find one. And I talked to some of the experts that were out there. The second thing I did went to the Ford dealership, and I took a 2014 F-150 Ford Drive, one with an EcoBoost engine, because I wanted to see what it was like in a big heavy truck as compared to what it would be like in this car. I didn't like it. And yeah, it was cool because, you know, for the truck it worked really great. It didn't feel like a V6. It didn't feel like a V6 at all. But the one thing that really turned me off was I wanted to open it up and see what it could do. And the salesman was with me the whole time, but I figured, you know what? What's he gonna do, kick me out? So I got onto the on-ramp of the highway, or was coasting onto the on-ramp of the highway, and I matted the gas pedal. And I was a little surprised by what I got. And what I got was a great deal of lag. The computer was trying to figure out what the heck just happened. We were coasting along at like 15 miles an hour, and next thing I know, I get a command for open throttle. It took a second. It took a couple of seconds. It was like a 1-2 count, and then it said, well, okay, I guess you want to accelerate now, and then it took off. Now, granted, this may be something that could be programmed out, what have you, but you know, we're talking about a drive-by-wire system. We're talking about a pretty sophisticated piece of kit. And could I do it? Eventually, maybe, but also the cost. To find one of those engines, the best place to do it is in a salvage F-150 that's out there that has one of those engines in it. So you have to go out looking for that engine in a wrecked truck someplace. I looked around, and I think the entry-level price was somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $15,000 for a wrecked one. So that in and of itself priced me out of a lot of things. And in addition, I needed to find one that was two-wheel drive because I didn't want to run a four-wheel drive transmission here. I needed to run a two-wheel drive transmission. With all of that said, the EcoBoost got tabled because it was too complicated and I couldn't find a way to run it. So that brings us to, well, Eric, what are you going to do instead? Well, let's go back under the hood and talk about it. So instead of the EcoBoost, I am going to go with a small block Ford. Probably a 302. You can also get a 351 Windsor, which is also technically a small block Ford with a larger displacement, but there's a lot more stuff that's available for the 302. Also, it's been in lots and lots of Mustangs. So the power plant of choice that I'm going for is going to be a Ford 302. If you play your cards right, you can actually get like 345-ish horsepower out of one of those things. So you've got more horsepower than displacement out of a small block Ford. Once again, let's go back to the plan. I want to be able to drive this car. I want to actually be able to get in this, turn the key, and go somewhere, and have an occasional amount of fun with somebody when they, you know, think they're so great at a stoplight. So the bottom line is I went for simplicity, I went for availability, and I went for just ease of putting the thing inside the car. So here's another little tidbit for you. While I was at SEMA this year, I went to the Ford booth and talked to some of the people at Ford Performance. Now the 302 I get could come from a couple of different places. The ideal place would be it coming from Ford directly. That would be so cool. I talked to the powers that be, and if it's in their budget and I can talk them out of an engine to put into this thing, well, that's what I'm gonna do. And I know you're saying, Eric, what about all the building? What about all the stuff that you could do with videos as far as rebuilding an engine and putting GoFest parts in it and all that kind of stuff? That is also a plan. Actually, what I was thinking was trying to find a Mustang of about this vintage that had all the parts I need, engine, transmission, rear end, and cannibalizing that to get all the parts I need to do this build. So that's also option B. But if I can get a Ford racing engine right out of the crate to drop into this, it's kind of a no-brainer. Right, so now we've covered what's going to power the Fairmont, which will be a small block Ford. And you're saying, okay, what's the next thing? Carbureted or fuel injected? I'm going to go with carbureted, once again for simplicity's sake. I figure with this build, I can go through the basics of a build, and I figure, well, the carburetor is an easy thing to do. It's pretty much ready to go right out of the box. No additional wiring, none of that other stuff that I'm going to have to mess with. This is a pretty simple car as it is. So I'm going to try to keep it simple. I kicked around the idea of fuel injection for a while, and I just kept coming back to the conclusion that simplicity was the way to go with this build. Now we've talked about the engine, so it'll be a carbureted small block Ford V8. Okay, what is the most important decision that I really needed to make about the car overall, more than anything else? Anyone? Well, some of you have seen the video that I did about tires. So think about it. All that time and effort that you're going to put into modifying this thing comes down to 4 different contact patches with the road. They're extremely important. If you can't deliver the power, if you can't allow the suspension to work like it's supposed to, you're losing before you even start playing the game. So what tires did I choose for the Fairmont? Drum roll please. I chose the Nitto NT555 tire for this car. And the main reason is it's probably one of the most popular tires to go on Mustangs. For those of you who are paying attention, this Ford Fairmont is a Fox body vehicle, which is the exact same platform that they use on the Ford Mustang from 79 all the way up through 92, I believe. So there are a lot of parts available, and that's the main reason why I chose this car. It looks like just a regular car, but in essence, it can be a Mustang underneath, and a lot of the Mustang parts that are out there will work on this vehicle. It's the main reason why I chose it. I looked for a set of tires that were going to be good road tires, things that I could drive. Like I said, I want to be able to drive this car. Once again, going back to that plan, sitting down, thinking about what exactly it is you want to do. And I'm planning a lot of this vehicle around those tires. In fact, they create something of a challenge, so to speak. So you're thinking, well, Eric, those 17-inch tires aren't going to fit on those 14-inch rims. You are absolutely correct. So the next thing I had to come up with was a plan for what type of wheels that I was going to use. And the plan that I came up with for that was using steel wheels, stock looking steel wheels with chrome centers. The steel wheels themselves are going to be the body color. That's the idea. I'm going to try to keep them body color, that way that I keep sort of the stealthy approach. Sure, somebody who knows what they're looking at is going to see those wheels and tires and go, and they'll probably get a clue from that. But otherwise, for the most part, the general populace is going to look at it and say, huh, that's weird, that's different, you don't see that every day. And then they'll see my taillights because I'll be waving bye-bye as I accelerate away. Yeah, and just to give you some idea, these tires here, probably have a contact patch of maybe somewhere around 5 to 6 inches. The new tires, I'm going to gain a couple inches both sides. So this tape measure represents about, it's going to be an 8-inch wide wheel. So this is going to be about the contact patch that I'm going to get over the top of what I have right now. So you can see that's going to be a significant difference in the amount of traction I'm going to be able to get out of this vehicle. So long as we're on the subject of tires and wheels, why don't we talk about the brakes? They're also going to be important. And something else I probably should have mentioned when we were talking about wheels is you'll notice that at the moment this is a 4-lug hub. Well, I'm going to be converting this over to 5-lug, both in the front and the rear back there. In the front here, that's a real easy thing to do. You just basically swap this rotor assembly to one with 5 lugs on it. Simple enough. In the back, it's a little more complicated because we're going to have to change the axles, but it doesn't matter anyway because we're changing out the entire rear end, but we'll get to that in a minute. For now, let's talk about brakes. While at SEMA, once again, see, there was more than one reason why I went to SEMA. One, because I wanted to go, but two, I wanted to make friends with a lot of the people that make a lot of the parts that you use for a build just like this. Well, I talked to Willwood and I told them about the build that I was doing and asked them what the best choice for brakes would be for this. And what they recommended for me was 12-inch rotors in the front and rear with 4-piston calipers. And I said, same size brakes on both the front and the rear? And they're like, yeah. Just, you know, that's the way to go. So that's what I will be doing. I will be doing 4-piston calipers in the front, 12-inch rotors, both up here and back there. He says that several people run that setup and works fairly well. I will also be converting over to steel braided brake lines. As long as we're here, let's talk about the suspension, because that's something else I am also going to be upgrading. What you're looking at here is the power steering rack bolted to the front of that K-member. And I probably should have mentioned that the straight 6 that's in this car presently fits in a special K-member. And the K-member is the thing that the engine actually sits in up front here, and the front suspension and all this stuff connects to it. So in order to put a V8 in here, I'm going to have to swap out this whole piece of metal, this whole K-member. And it just so happens they make a tubular version that bolts right in place of what I have here. And the tubular version is going to be much lighter and allow me to put that V8 in there. Well, in addition to that, I'm going to get rid of these big, bulky, old control arms and go for tubular control arms to make everything lighter. On top of that, these struts and these coils are going away, and I'm going with adjustable coilovers all the way around, both in the front and the rear. And what I mean when I say that is this coil spring will go away completely, and like a more traditional strut that you might be used to, I'm going to have a coil spring on the strut assembly itself. So it's going to be adjustable, so it can technically be called a coilover. And the reason why I want to go with adjustable coilovers is I want to be able to play with the ride height a little bit. I'm thinking all the way around, I'm going to drop this probably about 1.5 inches or so, no more than 2 inches, but I'm going to drop it about 1.5 inches. So the tire is going to sit up, tucked up inside this fender just a little bit. The other reason I'm doing that is to lower the center of gravity, because the lower a vehicle is, the better it can handle, because its center of gravity is lower. You know, that's how they have those rollover warnings on SUVs, because they sit up so high and the weight can actually cause the thing to tip over when you go around corners. Well, I want to keep this low and fast. I'll also lose all this weight up front. I'll be shedding a lot of weight in this vehicle because there's two ways of going about making power. One way is putting more power in. The other way is going to be getting rid of weight so that that power can be more effective. So losing weight, adding power, that's going to give me better performance. Stabilizers, bar and links, that will also be replaced with performance components. So all of this is pretty much going to get trashed. Now let's talk about steering. Here we're looking at the existing power steering rack. I've thought about this quite a bit, and I think what I'm going to do is switch it over to a manual rack. So in other words, I'm going to lose the power steering. Now you might be saying, Eric, why the heck would you want to do that? Well, I'm losing an entire hydraulic system, so I'm going to allow the engine to work more efficiently because it won't have to spin that fluid pump on the front to run the power steering. But also, it's going to be less parts, and lighter parts at that. They make a manual steering rack for this that is actually made for more of a racing application, a more road application. And I say I'm going to have better feedback. I say it's going to work better. It's going to be harder to park, but I've been working out, so I don't think it's going to be too much trouble. One more thing I'm going to have to do steering-wise. This joint right here is bad. In fact, every once in a while when I go to make a turn, it sort of binds up. So I'm going to trade out this whole shaft and everything going into the power steering rack, which is, as you can see, pretty easy to get to. Once again, I'm going to have a tubular K-member, so all this will go away. All this hunk of metal here, that's going away in favor of tubular stuff that everything else is going to bolt to. As long as we're talking about accessories and 86 and the power steering, why don't we talk a little bit about the cooling system and how I plan to modify that. First of all, this radiator won't be sufficient. This radiator is fine for the straight 6, but it's not going to be sufficient for the V8. So I'm going to be upgrading that to a larger aluminum radiator. I'm also going to be losing the cooling fan that's driven by the engine and swap it out for electric cooling fans. That's going to make things different as far as the electrical system is concerned, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that makes another opportunity to save the engine's power because it won't have to spin this fan all the time. The electric cooling fans will just come on when needed. Yes, they'll put an electrical load on the alternator, which in turn puts a mechanical load on the engine, but it won't be as much as trying to spin a radiator fan all the time. Now, as I said, I'm going to be using a carburetor, so we're going to stick with the carburetor setup on here. But what I am going to do is I am going to stick with the electronic ignition. It's going to give us a much better spark, allow us to make much better power. So that part of it is going to remain the same. Right now I have electronic ignition. I will also have electronic ignition in the upgraded car. So I'm not going to be running points and condenser or anything like that. Probably want to run an aftermarket ignition box and all that stuff. So we'll have to power all that up, and we'll be wiring that up as well. Well, as long as we're in the engine compartment, still on topic here, let's talk about the alternator. This alternator uses an external regulator. I'm going to change that. I'm going to go from the external regulator to an internal regulator, and I'm going to upgrade the alternator and the entire electrical system of this vehicle. I'm also going to be taking this battery from under the hood, and I would be moving it into the trunk. So that's something else that we'll be able to do here. This is the starter solenoid. Ford uses those external divorced type as opposed to some of the ones that are actually on top of the starter itself. A big part of this, and it's really easy to say this sentence, I'm going to upgrade the electrical system and move the battery to the back. It's really easy to say that. In practice, well, it's going to be a bit more involved. And I think you're going to enjoy that part of it because I've actually been reading up on that lately as well, looking at ways of upgrading older electrical systems like this. And I'm pretty excited to be bringing you that information with this build. There is one thing on my wish list that I may keep as far as accessories and underhood stuff, and that is air conditioning. I'm not going to use this old unit that's on here now. I'll probably go for an upgraded setup, but initially it's probably not going to be a part of the build just because I want to make sure that I have enough money to get the thing done. But when the time comes, I'd like to put the air conditioning back in and have functioning air conditioning in this vehicle as well. Now let's talk about our rear end. And now I'm speaking of this guy up here behind me. It is also known as the differential third member, but what it does is it takes the power that comes from the engine and transmission and transfers it to the rear wheels. There's several things about this differential that's in here presently that I do not like, that won't work for our purposes. First of which, it is just a regular differential, which means if you spin one wheel, the other wheel spins in the opposite direction, so power goes to the wheel with the least amount of traction. I can show you both at the same time. This one spins this way, the other one spins the opposite way. That's how differentials work. That's what's in most vehicles, and it's there so you can go around turns. You know what? I think I might put a link in the description to a really good video about how differentials work to help explain that to you. The second issue I have, aside from the fact that it doesn't have posi traction, because I want power to go to both wheels. So when I spin one wheel one way, the other wheel spins the same way. That's the type of thing. So in other words, the power is going to go to both wheels, not the one with the least amount of traction. So that's first and foremost. We're going through a lot of trouble to make more power here. We want to make sure that we can put it to the pavement. In addition, I'm going to change the gear ratio in the back here. Now this is set up for fuel economy, highway, that type thing. It's not really going to suit our purposes because we're taking it up a notch. I'm thinking about 355 or 373 gears for the rear end here. And I'm going to have to sit down and figure out some math as far as, you know, how that's going to work with my larger tires and all that kind of thing, because all that stuff does come into play. And like I said, this is the reason why you sit down and you come up with a plan, because you don't want to put like bigger tires or the wrong differential in and those parts don't work together. You're re-engineering this thing. So you got to sit down and do some math to try to figure it out. So the long and the short of it is that the higher that number is, the more it's going to take off from a line, but you're going to lose some top speed as a result. So you have to like walk a balance. And I'm trying to walk a balance between taking off from a dead stop, but also being able to maintain some fuel economy as I'm driving down the highway. Because like I said, I want to make this a driver. I want to be able to jump in this and drive to other cities or other places and do things. I want to have some fun with this. I don't want it to eat up a whole lot of gas. That's the other thing you'll find with taller gears. The higher that number is, the higher your tachometer is going to be as you're driving down the highway. That's why I'm going with the milder gears, which would be like a 355 or a 373. That being said, more specifically, I'm going to go for the Ford 8.8 rear end. So some people might say, hey, go for the 9-inch, that kind of thing. I don't think with the amount of power that I'm putting through here that I really have to concern myself with that. The other nice thing about a 9-inch rear end is that it has a removable carrier assembly that you can take right out the front of the differential. It's real nice to be able to swap gears over. You can have a track set of gears that maybe do have those really tall gears, and then drive there. You could put a highway set of gears in there and cruise on the highway all day long, so you could have it be dual purpose. I'm not going to go that route. I'm just going to leave it and sealed up. There's plenty of stuff out there for the 8.8, and it's good enough for my purposes. Remember, I'm maximum going to have like 350 in this engine, so I'm not too concerned about it right off. But 8.8 rear end, 355 or 373 gears is what we're going to do back here. The suspension back here is going to get modified a little bit as well. I'm going to go with new arms. This is, I believe, affectionately referred to by some as a 4-link suspension. I'm doing the adjustable coilovers again back here, so the suspension will be handled a little bit differently. I may have to actually get different coil springs because the availability of adjustable coilovers for the rear on these vehicles is somewhat lax. Now, some of you may remember that I had mentioned the possibility of going with an independent rear suspension back here. I looked into that, and for the amount of gain that I would get from it, I don't really think it's worth it. I think it's better to go cheaper and lighter, because that setup is actually heavier than this. Yes, I know there are mud daubers back here, but they're actually heavier than this and a little more complex to get set up correctly. So I'm going with a straight axle. Also, there's going to need to be some reinforcement that needs to be done. I've looked up on Mustang forums and things like that, and it appears that one of these connections, I believe, where this lower control arm comes in here, this is a pretty weak connection in here, so I'll have to reinforce that. As long as we're staring at this muffler, let's talk about the exhaust system a little bit. Obviously with the V8 it's going to be different. I'm going to have dual exhaust. It's going to have some form of crossover up here close to the front. That's something you actually want to do to help equalize the power output of the engine. I'm probably not going to run a catalytic converter. I'm still on the fence on that. I know this one came with it, but I don't have to run one. I'm in a state to where it's not an issue that I have to worry about with emissions. Also, this vehicle, I believe, is old enough to where it's not going to be a concern. So if I don't have to run it, I won't run it. And for all of you environmentalists out there that may be screaming at me for that, I want you to think about something. I'm not going to be driving this as much as I would a daily driven car. So, you know, take that into consideration. But here's the thing I thought about with the exhaust. I was thinking about running stock mufflers on it, or quiet mufflers. So good mufflers, but quiet mufflers on both sides back here, and then have the exhaust come out. But here's the sleeper part, which I think would be a lot of fun to do, And I know I'm not going to be able to find bolt-on parts for this. I'm going to have to find some way to make this happen, but putting electric cutouts on the exhaust and then running pipes right out the side over here and on that side, so that I can just flip a switch inside the car and bypass all the mufflers and the rest of the exhaust and just run straight pipes off the engine, that would scare the heck out of somebody. Talk about a sleeper. And briefly, let's touch on the fuel system. I'm going to be keeping this stock gas tank in here. However, I'm going to be losing the mechanical fuel pump on the engine. That's driven by the engine and can actually rob just a little bit of power from the engine. Outside of that, I think I'd get more consistency from an electric fuel pump, which will probably end up being mounted up in here somewhere. So that's part of our electrical upgrade on this, is we're going to be adding an electric fuel pump that's going to be adding more of an amp load onto the electrical system that we're going to have to consider as well. The other thing an electric fuel pump will allow me to do, the addition of a kill switch. Here's something I really didn't want to forget about. What I'm going to do about the body and the body flex. This vehicle is a unibody car, which means the body of the car gives it structural integrity. Well, let's just say to start with, Ford didn't give it a whole lot of advantages. So to correct that, my plan is to put frame connectors in underneath. Now, I had also considered, and I may still consider it yet, putting a roll cage in this car. That will give it structural integrity and rigidity and allow the suspension to work a lot better and pretty much eliminate that body flex altogether. However, it's easier and stealthier. Somebody's going to notice a roll cage inside the car, I'm pretty sure. I'm already pushing the limits with the tires and wheels that I'll be using, but I'll really be pushing the limits if they see a roll cage. But that being said, you can get frame connectors that you can weld in here that basically connect the front and back of the car, that gives it a lot more structural integrity and rigidity. Now we're inside. Let's talk about the dash a little bit. I think you'll notice that it's pretty sparse with what it has as far as gauges goes. A few idiot lights, fuel gauge, not even a temperature gauge or anything like that, and a speedometer and a gear indicator. That's it. I want to put a full set of gauges in. I want to know my volts, I want to know my oil pressure, I want to know my coolant temperature. I want to know at the very least those three things, in addition to how fast I'm going and how much gas I have left in a tank. I believe what I'm going to have to do, and I've been contacted by a viewer about this, there was apparently a different dashboard that Ford offered that had different gauges in it that could be used in these cars. Or I'm actually thinking I might end up making a custom gauge setup. This I don't think is going to fool with the sleeper aspect too much, unless somebody's looking inside the car. But what it'll allow me to do is get all those gauges that I want, but also still maintain a somewhat sleeper look to it. I'm also going to change out the steering wheel. I've never really been happy with it. I mean, it's just a silly steering wheel, but just something that's a little meatier, and get rid of this cover. I like this cover for some reason, but yeah, this old spindly steering wheel, it's kind of got to go, and it doesn't really work for me. I think more importantly, like I said, this is going to be a nice part of this build, that it's going to cover, how to wire up the gauges, how to get everything, making a custom dashboard. I may have to find my own speedometer in order to make it work, fuel gauge, everything else, and I may just completely redesign this whole dashboard so that I can have my own custom setup here. Also, as I said, I'd like some switches for like the cutouts for the exhaust, and also I want to put in a kill switch. That's not going to be on the dash, obviously. But that being said, I'm looking to upgrade the dash assembly in this to go along with this whole part of the build. Now, the astute viewer may note that I haven't mentioned anything about the transmission yet, and that's because I'm saving that for last. We pretty much covered all the other systems that I'm going to be upgrading and how I'm going to go about upgrading, or at least my plans for them at this time, with the exception of the transmission. And that little surprise I have for you is I've decided to go back on my automatic transmission thoughts on this car to begin with, and I'm going to be putting in a 5-speed manual. Yes, you heard that correctly. I will be taking this from an automatic transmission to a manual transmission, and I can't tell you how many times I've been asked about doing one of those conversions. Well, here we are with the Fairmont. That's a perfect opportunity. The more I thought about it, the more I said, you know what, I want to make something that I'm going to have a lot of fun driving. And there's nothing like driving a V8 with a manual transmission, which means I'm going to have to upgrade my pedals, my brake pedal, and put a clutch pedal in. And to that end, I've spoken to the people at Willwood, and they make a setup that has those two pedals and master cylinders for both the clutch and for the brake system itself. So I'm going to have manual brakes. I'm not going to have power brakes. So that's another thing that's going to be manual with this car. So there's going to be a lot of manual things. It'll have manual steering, manual transmission, manual brakes. So it's going to be pretty straightforward. But I think you'll like the setup that I'm looking at, because it actually has an adjustable setup to where it doesn't use a proportioning valve for the front and the rear. And the way it's actually adjustable, the amount of pressure and amount of force that you send to the rear and the front wheels. That I'm kind of excited about, because I've never done anything or even considered anything like that in the past. And once again, the people at Will would assure me that it's something that people do and they're very happy with that setup. So that should be a lot of fun doing that. Plus, you know, cutting a hole in the floor so we can put the shifter up through and everything else. So T5 transmission to go behind that small block Ford V8. Right, so there's one last super important bit of information with this plan and this build that we need to cover, and that is the budget. And it's probably the most important consideration with any build, I think. And I think that's one of the things that's going to help keep you grounded and realistic about your build. I'm sure you can throw a bunch of go-fast parts at something and spend a lot of money doing it, but you want it all to work. So planning it out and also having a budget for it is going to help. I can tell you, whenever you do this type of work, there's going to be all those little things. And when I say little things, I mean that special bolt that you're going to need to run to the hardware store and get that cost you, you know, maybe $1.29, but then you have to think of the gas and everything that got you there. Maybe that special tool that you're going to need to do that one particular function to get this thing to go together. I'm sure going to be tons of stuff like that along the way, little things that are going to eat into our budget. So I have set aside a budget for this build of between $10,000 and $15,000. I think that's a realistic budget. Like I said, if I'm able to find a donor car to get all the major components out of, I think that's going to be a win in many ways. So I've got my finger crossed that that may work out. Now that we've talked about the money, let's talk about time. What is the time frame for this build? Well, to get that $10,000, $15,000, there's a bunch of work that I need to do between now and the end of March. And that is basically the plan. There's something that I worked out, and that I believe will get me the finances I need in order to get this build done. Very excited about that and that opportunity. To that end, that means that I'm going to need to get that work done before I start this build, which means, realistically speaking, we'll probably start in the middle of 2015 with this. If I'm lucky, I'll be able to wrap it up by the end of the year. If not, it may go into 2016 a little bit. Just depends on how everything works out. I don't want this to be one of those projects that just sits around doing nothing, collecting dust, and, you know, a bunch of money was spent and you never went anywhere with it. I want to be able to complete this. I want to be able to do it from front to back. I think one of the things that's probably going to take me the longest is the electrical system. I want to take my time and get that all set up properly, and probably put in new fuse boxes and everything else, and different size cables. There's a lot to that. I think you're going to enjoy that part of it, as I said. All that being said, I want to be realistic about it, and being realistic about it, I think I can have the money together probably by sometime in April, which means May, June is probably when I'll start the build. As soon as I have the money together, that's what I'm going to do. And that's the unique thing about this build, is that I kind of have to do it all at once. You might think, you know, and you might be able to do just a little bit at a time. You might be able to just put the rear end in. You might be able to just do this or do that along the way with your build. That'd be great. But looking at this, the main thing that's going to set me back is that K-member. So when I replace that K-member to put the new engine in, I'm going to have to replace the entire front suspension and everything along with that. And if I'm going to do that, might as well do the transmission, all of it. Might as well just bite the bullet and get it all done. About the only thing I could think I could do preemptively is the frame connectors. And that may come in a not so distant future video for you, as far as, you know, helping to wet your palate with the build. Well, there we have it. The plan, the build, the budget, and all those things and all those targets that I'm hoping to hit through this year and possibly into next. I think by the time I'm done, I'm going to have a really killer sleeper, something that's a lot of fun to drive. And that's my end goal. And should you consider embarking on a project like this, I would strongly advise you to do the same thing. Sit down, plan it out, figure out what it is that works, what doesn't work. You know, consult with forums, consult with experts, just go out into the world and see what you can figure out before you actually go out and start spending your money. You want to spend it well. Maybe somebody's tried something and it didn't work out and they've got a better solution, and away you go. You just saved yourself a bunch of time and possibly a lot of money there. So I hope this video has provided a general blueprint of what you do when you go about modifying a vehicle. More specifically, it's exactly what I'm going to do with the 1979 Ford Fairmont. Hey, if you have automotive questions that were not addressed in this video, I would ask that you head over to EricTheCarGuy.com. There's a welcome video there to tell you about all of our amazing features to help you with automotive issues should you have them. If you wish to connect with me socially, I can be found on Google+, Facebook, Twitter, and now Instagram. And I close each of my videos with be safe, have fun, and stay dirty. And trust me, I can't wait to start working on this thing either.